When you encounter a narcissistic woman who thrives on emotional dominance, the one thing that unsettles her more than anything else is emotional unavailability. Not the cold, detached kind, but the calm, self-contained presence that does not respond to provocation. She obsesses over the person whose emotional world cannot be hijacked because her entire psychological strategy depends on eliciting predictable reactions. Narcissism feeds on response. It feeds on the rise in your voice, the shift in your posture, the tension in your breath. When you don't offer those cues, she loses the map that guides her manipulation. You become, in her mind, an enigma she cannot decode. It's a strange paradox. The less available you are to her emotional tactics, the more invested she becomes in trying to pull something, anything, out of you. Your neutrality creates a void, and the narcissistic psyche cannot tolerate a void. She will project onto you elaborate narratives, imagining that your calmness is a form of hidden superiority or a deliberate challenge. She cannot comprehend that you simply do not place her at the center of your emotional universe, and because she cannot understand it, she becomes fascinated by it. This fascination quickly turns into psychological pursuit. She tests you, studies you, pushes boundaries in subtle ways, all in an attempt to uncover your weak spots. But what really heightens the obsession is that you do not reveal anything, you don't explain yourself, you don't justify your decisions, you don't collapse under pressure or reward her with emotional excess. You remain steady, self-directed, inwardly anchored. In Jungian terms, you are not participating in her psychic inflation. You are not feeding the archetype she is trying to embody. And without that fuel, she starts spiraling further into projection, trying to create meaning where none exists. To her, your emotional independence is a kind of power, one she wants to conquer because she cannot replicate. She lives externally through the reactions of others. You live internally, guided by a stable center. Contrast alone is enough to trigger an obsession that she cannot walk away from easily. And the irony is that the more she tries to control the emotional exchange, the more she exposes her own dependency on it. In the end, the most powerful stance you can take is simple. Remain rooted in yourself. Nothing destabilizes a narcissistic pursuit more than a person who refuses to surrender their emotional freedom. A narcissistic woman becomes deeply fixated on someone who carries strong boundaries, because boundaries disrupt the core mechanism she relies on, blurring lines until your emotional world becomes an extension of hers. When she meets someone who refuses to bend, she encounters a kind of psychological resistance that is foreign to her. Most people, out of fear, confusion, or a desire to avoid conflict, gradually surrender their limits. But the person with strong boundaries sends a silent yet unmistakable message: my inner life is not accessible on demand. That sense of sovereignty is what she cannot tolerate, and paradoxically, what she cannot walk away from. There is something profoundly stabilizing about a person who knows where they end and where another begins. Boundaries are not walls, they are markers of self-respect, evidence that you understand your own value, and when you enforce them calmly, without aggression, without apology, you awaken in her a psychological tension. She senses that she cannot move you with the typical emotional levers. She cannot guilt you, charm you, provoke you, or seduce you into abandoning your position. Every attempt to test your limits only reinforces the reality that your sense of self is not constructed around her approval. In a Jungian sense, the narcissist is always searching for an external figure to complete the fragmented self-image within. But a person with strong boundaries refuses that unconscious invitation. You don't play the role she wants you to play in her psychic drama. And because you won't join the script, she becomes increasingly captivated by your refusal. You represent something she both envies and resents, an inner solidity, a self that does not need her, that does not orbit around her moods, that does not collapse into her emotional gravity. This is where the obsession takes root. She tries to decode your strength, to unravel what makes you so self-contained. She pushes harder, hoping to find the crack in your armor, But the more you hold your ground, the more she feels compelled to understand the mystery she cannot dominate. It becomes a psychological pursuit wrapped in ego, insecurity, and fascination all at once. And the truth is simple. When you maintain your boundaries, you are not resisting her, you are respecting yourself. And nothing captures a narcissist's attention more intensely than a person who cannot be moved, manipulated, or reshaped. Stand firm, because every boundary you protect is a declaration of who you are and who you refuse to become. One of the most powerful forces that disrupts a narcissistic woman's psychological framework is a person who simply does not seek her validation. Her entire relational strategy revolves around positioning herself as the emotional center, someone you must impress, pursue, or depend on for approval. When you remove yourself from that dynamic and stop looking to her for affirmation, you create a kind of existential silence that she cannot tolerate. She thrives on being the mirror through which others evaluate themselves. So when you refuse to use that mirror, she begins to lose her sense of importance in your world, and that loss becomes the source of her growing obsession. It's not that you become indifferent or cold, it's that your sense of worth is not connected to her opinion. You don't rise when she praises you, and you don't fall when she withdraws affection. You remain centered. You remain internally governed. And this internal orientation is something she cannot replicate or understand. In her mind, validation is currency. It is how she buys influence, control, and emotional leverage. When the currency has no value to you, she cannot negotiate her way into your psyche. This independence creates a psychological disruption. She begins to wonder why her approval doesn't move you. She starts to question why you don't adjust yourself to gain her liking. She may even feel threatened by the fact that you are guided by a deeper compass, one that doesn't turn in her direction. And the more she wonders, the more she watches. She starts observing you in ways that reveal her fixation, interpreting your silence as confidence, your calmness as superiority, your restraint as strength. What she cannot possess, she begins to idealize, even if she resents it. Jung's language, you refuse to participate in her symbolic theater. You don't project your worth onto her, nor do you absorb the identity she tries to impose. You stand as an individual rather than a reflection, and this unmasks the fragile architecture beneath her persona. She becomes increasingly invested in proving that she can affect you, that she can still pull a response from you, that she can still be the standard by which you evaluate yourself. And the more she fails, the more the obsession tightens its grip. The simple truth is this: when your self-worth is self-generated, you become untouchable. And to a narcissistic mind built on external validation, nothing is more irresistible or more infuriating than someone who no longer needs their approval to know who they are. There is a particular kind of person who unsettles a narcissistic woman more than any other, the one who sees through her carefully constructed persona. Most people fall for the presentation, the charm, the confidence, the emotional intensity that often appears as passion or depth. But when you look past all that and recognize the underlying patterns, the manipulation, the insecurity, the exaggerated self-importance, you disrupt the illusion she depends on. And narcissism cannot survive without illusion. It requires an audience, a believer, someone who accepts the performance as reality. When you don't, she feels exposed in a way that shakes the foundation of her identity. What makes this dynamic especially powerful is that you don't confront her directly. You don't attack, accuse, or attempt to diagnose her behavior. You simply notice. Your perception is quiet but unmistakable. You respond differently. You engage differently. And you refuse to be swept into the emotional theatrics. And that subtle awareness becomes a kind of psychological mirror she cannot control. Unlike the people she manipulates, you reflect back something she doesn't want to see: her own insecurity, her own fear of inadequacy, her own dependency on external validation. In Jungian terms, you perceive the shadow she refuses to acknowledge, and seeing someone's shadow, truly seeing it, creates a tension that is impossible for the narcissistic psyche to ignore. She may even experience your insight as a silent threat, not because you intend harm, but because your clarity dismantles the fantasy she uses to structure her relationships. You are the witness she cannot deceive, and this both fascinates and frightens her. This is where the obsession begins to take shape. She becomes intensely curious about how much you truly understand. She wonders what you're thinking, what you know, what you've figured out. She may try to test your insight, pretending vulnerability to see how you respond, or launching subtle provocations to gauge whether you're still watching. The truth is, she becomes more fixated on the one person who refuses to be hypnotized by her narrative than on anyone who admires her, because admiration is predictable. Awareness is not, and the lesson here is simple. Clarity is power.
See a person as they are without
projecting fantasies or fears onto them. You become immune to their manipulation. And that immunity, in the eyes of a narcissist, is both a threat and an irresistible mystery. One of the most disorienting experiences for a narcissistic woman is encountering someone who remains calm while she unleashes emotional turbulence. Her strategies rely on creating internal chaos, sparking jealousy, confusion, guilt, or defensiveness, because emotional upheaval is the doorway through which she enters your psychological space. When you stay centered, when your voice doesn't rise, when your breathing doesn't shift, when your energy remains grounded, you deny her that access. And that denial becomes a kind of emotional puzzle she can't stop trying to solve. Calmness in this context is not passivity. It is a form of strength, a quiet command over your own inner landscape. Where others might react instinctively, you respond deliberately. You don't absorb the chaos she radiates, nor do you internalize the narrative she tries to impose. You stand as an observer, present, aware, but unshaken. This emotional neutrality threatens her sense of control because it sends a message she cannot ignore. Her storms do not define your climate. In a psychological sense, this calmness represents individuation, Jung's idea of becoming whole within yourself, rather than being shaped by external forces. A narcissistic woman expects your emotions to mirror hers, to rise when she rises and fall when she withdraws. But the person who has achieved a degree of inner integration cannot be pulled into those cycles. Your emotional state is not reactive, it is self-authored, and that autonomy is something she both envies and resents. When you don't match her intensity, she begins to escalate. She tests boundaries more aggressively, heightens the drama, or shifts tactics entirely, all in an attempt to provoke a reaction. Yet each failure deepens her fascination. She starts wondering what protects you, what anchors you, what gives you the ability to remain composed when others crumble. She may even misinterpret your calmness as superiority or hidden power, because in her world, emotional stability is rarely genuine. It is usually a manipulative tactic. The concept of someone simply being grounded is almost foreign to her, but the real reason she becomes obsessed is simple. Your calmness reveals the instability within her. It highlights the contrast between your internal coherence and her internal fragmentation. And in that contrast, she sees something she cannot imitate. Remember this. Calmness is not just a response. It is a declaration. When you remain steady in the presence of emotional storms, you are quietly telling the world that your inner peace is not for sale. Nothing triggers a deeper obsession in a narcissistic woman than a person who can walk away without fear. This is not the impulsive disappearance rooted in avoidance or emotional immaturity. This is the quiet, deliberate choice made by someone who refuses to be controlled. When you're willing to leave the moment you sense your dignity slipping, you signal a level of self-possession that she cannot manipulate. And that, more than anything, threatens her sense of dominance. Walking away does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing your psychological freedom for someone else's instability. It means you see the pattern clearly, you recognize the cost, and you choose yourself. Most people stay longer than they should, out of hope, confusion, guilt, or the desire to fix what was never theirs to fix. But the person who can detach from the performance, the drama, the emotional hooks, and simply step out of the dynamic altogether becomes someone she cannot forget. Because to a narcissistic mind, detachment feels like rejection, and rejection feels like humiliation, and humiliation must be reversed, rewritten, or conquered. That's where the obsession begins. In Jungian terms, the willingness to walk away reflects individuation, a psychological maturity where your inner compass guides you more strongly than any external influence. You are not seeking completion through the relationship, and you are not trying to patch someone else's fractured self-image. You understand your worth deeply enough that losing someone does not mean losing yourself, and that realization strips away the power she assumes she has over you. To a narcissistic woman, control is not just a desire, it is an emotional survival mechanism. When you demonstrate that her approval, affection, promises, or threats cannot hold you, you disrupt that mechanism entirely. She becomes unsettled by your independence, by your clarity, by the fact that you do not cling. She starts replaying every moment, trying to figure out where she lost her influence. And the more she attempts to pull you back into her orbit, the more she confronts the reality that you cannot be pulled. And that is the paradox. The moment you stop fighting for her is the moment she begins fighting for you, not out of love, but out of a desperate attempt to restore the power she once imagined she had. The greatest act of strength is knowing when enough is enough, and having the courage to walk away with your integrity intact.